All right, I'm going to be talking about translating recipes, which a lot of people think is an easy task, but it's actually not easy. It might seem simple because it's just a list of food products and simple instructions, but it actually has a lot of problems that are associated with it, which I am going to be explaining in this presentation. Here are some of the problems that can come up as you translate recipes. First, when you translate recipes, you also often have to translate measurements because different countries use different systems of measurement. For example, in the US, we use the customary system of measurement like pounds, cups, fluid ounces, things like that. When you convert any kind of measurement, it changes the proportion, it changes the ratio. So, for example, if you translate cups to liters or milliliters, um, you might be using equivalents, but it's going to change the ratio, which can change the result of the final product. Another example is culinary expertise. In some recipes, in some cultures, it's normal to have less detail in instructions and recipes. For example, in French recipes, they don't use as much detail. Um, this might be because French people are more likely to have culinary knowledge or because they like to have the freedom to change the recipe. But for British English recipe users, for example, they tend to really like these detailed instructions. So the translator then has to change these simple instructions and understand what the creator of the recipe meant in order to expand them for a different audience. The third problem is ingredients, and this is the problem that I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation. So I have an example here of a recipe that I'm familiar with from my mission. I served in the Dominican Republic, and tres golpes is something that's eaten for breakfast there. It's basically mashed plantains with pickled onions, fried egg, fried cheese, and salami. But this salami is very difficult to get, at least the way that it's made in the DR, in anywhere other than the DR. Um, my roommate and I tried to make this a few months ago, and we went to a couple different Hispanic markets and we couldn't find it. And I actually just looked online recently for this salami, and it was sold out on or out of stock on all the websites that I saw it on. So, making Dominican tres golpes in the way that I'm used to preparing it was not available to me. We ended up using breakfast sausage instead of Dominican salami, so we substituted that ingredient when we made it. A couple other examples of ingredients that can be hard to translate are piment d'Espelette, which is a common French spice, but it's not easily found in the US or in the UK. So when recipes are translated from French to English, translators have to keep that in mind that that ingredient is not going to be readily available for their audience. Dashi stock is another example of an ingredient that's commonly found in Japanese recipes. It's a stock that's made out of seaweed and bonito flakes, and there's not an equivalent of this in Western culture. So when you translate recipes from Japanese, it's very difficult to get that exact same flavor that the dashi stock has. One solution that translators use is to find a suitable alternative in the target culture. For example, I mentioned that instead of using Dominican salami, my roommate and I used breakfast sausage, which was readily available to us when we made tres golpes. And the pro to substituting ingredients is that it makes the recipe as accessible as possible for the average user in the target culture. So just a normal person who's cooking for their family, they'll be able to find that ingredient at their local grocery store. But one disadvantage is that some authenticity of the original recipe is lost, which is important to some people. Another example of substitution is for piment d'Espelette. When people translate recipes from French to English, one substitute that they might use is hot paprika, which is easy to find in the US and in the UK. Solution two is to just leave the name of the ingredient untouched. The advantage of this is that it maintains the authenticity of the recipe. This might be really important for someone who's a professional chef or someone who's really trying to understand the culture and see what that recipe would really taste like and look like in the target or in the source culture. The con is that this is going to be really difficult for the person who's just cooking for their family or the average recipe user. They're not going to be able to find this ingredient in their local grocery store, so it might be impossible for them to make the recipe themselves. The third solution is a combination of the last two solutions. So the original name of the ingredient is maintained, the ingredient is described, and some possible suggestions are given for how a person in the target culture could replace this ingredient that's difficult to find. The pro of doing this is that it's helpful for both the average recipe user, the person who just cooks at home, and the professional, the person who is more familiar with the culture, because they have all the information they need to get the original ingredient if they want it, to understand what it does, and to um, know what they might use instead if they do just want to use whatever's in their local grocery store. The con to this is that it could make the recipe long and complicated if someone's just looking to make dinner that night, for example. Sometimes you see a recipe that is just so long and you just skip down to like the actual ingredients and the directions. And so for the person who does that, this might not be helpful for them. Here's an example of a recipe that uses the third solution that I talked about. I found this recipe online for dashi-free miso soup. So this is a Japanese recipe. And here it defines what dashi is, what kind of flavor it has, and what it's made of, and things like that. And then down here, it gives a suggestion for a substitute. In this case, it substituted hearty vegetable broth for the dashi stock. So I included a picture of it here. So this is a great example of a recipe that uses that third solution. And here are my terms and translations. I've included British English to American English, as well as terms from Hungarian, Czech, Italian, Bulgarian, things like that. And then I've also translated them to Spanish. Here are some websites that you can visit if you want to learn more about recipe translation or if you want to translate a recipe yourself and need help. And here are my discussion questions. Thanks for watching.